I was commissioned in July of '93 and retired in November of 2013. So the highest rank that I attained in the military was a lieutenant colonel. I really didn't have a plan on what I was going to do. I was just going to go into college. I had transferred up to Alabama from a smaller school. And my roommate at the time had just got done with basic training. So he was on a scholarship and had to go to basic training. He was an SMP cadet, they called it. And he came back and he had some good friends that were at the college, and we all got to hanging out and doing different things. And I thought, man, I really like these guys. They're good people. So that got me around people who were recruiting for Army ROTC. And they convinced me, said, hey, if you'll go to what's called basic camps, basically basic light for officers, right? Sort of like gives you an exposure to the military. You could get a scholarship. So I did. The next summer I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and did really, really well at the basic camp, got a full scholarship to go to school on. And that was the key. Okay, I said, if I get a full scholarship, I'll sign up. And I did. I got a scholarship to go and finish my last few years at Alabama with an RTC scholarship. At the University of Alabama, I'd met a number of people that I really thought a lot of, and that drove what branch I ultimately chose. There are a few people that were kind of influential in that, just people that I really enjoyed being around. So I had also heard that if you went into the Army, you could fly. And so I watched Tom Cruise as a kid, right, who didn't want to fly F-14s off the carrier. Well, I realized the Army didn't have F-14s, but they did have helicopters, right? So again, did really well at Alabama and was able to be one of the top cadets to graduate. And I was able to get the single aviation course that year. And so I left to go to Fort Rucker to go to Army, their helicopter program. Well, one of my first memorable experiences in the military was the first time I ever got in a helicopter to take off. I'd never flown in an airplane till I got to Alabama, and that was to go to basic camp. I came from a really, really small part of America. The first time I'm in a helicopter with my buddy, Bryce Dudley, who's in the front with the instructor pilot. I'm sitting in the jump seat in a Huey, and we pick up to a hover at about 5 foot, and I made the decision right there, I have chosen the wrong path. This is not for me. What have I done? And about an hour later, I was the person sitting in the front and still had thought I had really chosen the wrong path. But I stuck with it and again, did pretty well and was able to get tracked into Apaches. So I got to fly Apaches. And this was, I graduated flight school in about '94, ended up graduating from the Apache course in '95, got to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, assigned to 18th Airborne Corps to one of the 2 attack battalions there. And within a year of getting there, we were deployed to Bosnia. And so, I mean, what a great opportunity to lead people. At that time, there were no wars, so it was a great opportunity to go lead people in what was the closest thing to it, which was Bosnia. At the same time, you know, had gotten married Carrie out of college. We left, had a child within a very short period of time, a second one by the time I got ready to deploy to Bosnia. And while I was deployed to Bosnia, she was pregnant with our third. So that's a very memorable experience, is having a wife at home pregnant with a child with 2 others while you're deployed. That's probably the first welcome to the Army. But came back from there, did 6 months over there, flew a lot. And what I really enjoyed most of anything, though, was leading soldiers. I had a support platoon. I was a pilot in command of an aircraft, but I could also go out with soldiers and roll the roads in a convoy. And that was probably one of the most memorable things for me. We're in Bosnia, and it was in the middle of a lot of just chaos going on, snipings and other stuff going on. I'm at a place which was a fob to get fuel and food, and you go in and get an intel brief, and there was this major in there. And I walked in, and he said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Glamok, got to go through these towns into the British sector. And he goes, I don't recommend you go. That's a really dangerous area. A lot of rioting, things going on, random shootings. And I'm like, shoot. And those days, you didn't have cell phones. So I had left my battalion headquarters, and the next thing they expected from me was an update via an aircraft at 20,000 foot called Magic. And I was bound and determined I had to make comms with these guys. I'm like, I got to get there because my boss is expecting me to be there today. So he's like, I don't recommend you go. I'm like, I'm going. I was a first lieutenant. I was pretty, experienced. So I walk out with my whole platoon, and they walk up to me, and I give them the intel update brief, and they're all looking at me kind of big-eyed because nobody really had combat experience then. And I said, and we're going. And this young female goes, "Put me on the 60, sir." And I'm like, that's the kind of stuff you want to hear from soldiers, right? I'm like, all right, Alan, crawl up there. You're on the 60. But Bosnia went well. I came out of there, ended up going to the infantry advanced course. So I learned a ton from the infantry guys. And it just so happened they were the same people I then went to Korea with. Spent 15 months in Korea over in 2nd Infantry Division, commanded an Apache company. While there, really had started from the beginning. I got to Fort Rucker to flight school. I wanted to go to Special Operations. And I always had a view of going to Task Force 160. And, so I was in really good shape. Had been blessed to be able to fly a lot at units that flew a lot, and I flew a lot of goggles. So I was able to go up while there and assess for the Task Force 160 and got picked up to go back to the regiment. That's when I learned what the Army does, which is, that's great. I'm glad that's what you want to do, but that's not what you're going to go do. So you're going to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and be an OC. And so for 2 years, I left Korea, went to Fort Polk, Louisiana. Probably one of the best decisions I could have ever made, to go to Fort Polk. I learned a lot, and I watched my peers come through on rotations. I flew like crazy. I would fly 60 hours a month, most of that under goggles. I was also on jump status, so I was jumping again. So it was a good prep and transition to go to the 160th. September 11th, 2001, I was in the gym at Fort Polk, Louisiana, working out. I watched the planes fly into the second plane fly into the building, the World Trade Center. Literally 30 days later, I show up at the regiment and they're gone. There's very few people there. And the ones who are left there are very disgruntled because no one wants to be left behind. And I start training, so I go to Green Platoon, and it's about a 6-month process there just to take you from what the Army taught you. And I had almost 1,000 hours, but they basically retrain you from start to finish, from how to shoot, to how to put a bandage on, to how to fly, everything. And so I show up and I arrive at the company in April 2002, and August 2002 I deploy. But I don't go to Afghanistan. I end up in a place called Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. And I'm working at the CAOP, Combined Air Ops Center. And so what I get to see as a mid-grade captain is the whole air war orchestrated. It was a great learning experience for me. I come back home after being over there for 60 days or so, and Iraq is right around the corner. We're starting to prep. We've had all the briefs are in the fall of 2002. We're already being told we're probably going to go. We start working on the O plan, and in the spring of 2003, I'm with the first package going out for the invasion of Iraq. And I, of course, didn't think it was going to really happen. We used to always say, I'll believe it when the C5s show up. Well, by God, the C5s showed up. And so, of course, that was a pretty, I think, traumatic experience for my family, is me loading out to go do that. Because it's an interesting place, because you can't really say where you're going. You're just leaving. But Carrie and the kids obviously knew what was going on from the news. And so we blew out. We set up in a small spot called RR in the middle of nowhere in Saudi Arabia. And it was us and all the ground forces we support, all of them. And we start getting ready to go. And of course, the French stop us from the first attack time frame. So we get delayed by the French, and it took us about another week or so, but inevitably we crossed the berm. And that was the beginning. It was April 2003. And my first time I crossed the berm with a friend of mine named Chris Van Kuyk. Chris was known as Jinxie Cat, because if you look at Chris, you could almost guarantee you weren't going to go. And he was a great dude, 50 years old, CW5, had been flying for almost 30 years. Started out in the Ranger Regiment. And one of my greatest friends and great leader that I learned a lot from, but my first missions were hide site ops out in the western desert of Iraq. And so we were trying to sever the landlock to keep all of Saddam and his guys from fleeing into Jordan. So we had an entire Delta squadron with us and a Ranger platoon. And we were hiding out in the middle of the Western Desert. We would hide in the daytime, fully fold, cover the aircraft, and at night we'd unfold and come up on comms and wait to hear what we were going to go do. So did a few missions out there, but that was really the beginning of, I kind of call it the Wild Wild West. It was just us figuring things out. Some simple things like, how are you going to get home from there? Well, I don't know. We're just going to fly to this airfield with the little birds and find a C-130 going south to RR. And so we did. We flew in the middle of the night, landed at some little blacked out airstrip. There were a bunch of Talons sitting out there for different reasons. We would knock on the back end of it. The crew chief would lower the door and like, hey, I got these little birds. We need to go to RR. Will you take us? And they're like, well, shit, yeah, I got nothing on board. Load them up, boys. We would just walk up to some E6 and a couple of Talon guys. Can we get a ride? Absolutely, load up. And so just those kind of things, I think, shapes you a lot as a young officer, because you go from having someone tell you what to do to you having to figure it out with your guys how to do it. Within a day and a half or so, we were back in Baghdad, again at night, loaded out on the Talons, landing on a taxiway, and we push off the little birds. And that's the beginning of the look for Shoshana Johnson and that whole crowd that were part of the Jessica Lynch thing. And we think they're in a prison not far away in Abu Ghraib. And we go to bed that night, do some planning, and wake up the next morning, plan again. And that night, we go to fly a mission. And it's the first mission I'd ever done with an armored cavalry regiment. And this is out of Savannah, Georgia, and we had attached a Cav squadron to a special mission unit, the most unbelievable thing you've ever heard of in your life, like the slowest to move to the most lethal, fast organization in the world. And we really got a great example of what troop leading procedures were in a mechanized organization at that time. So we did end up doing the mission that night, and they, of course, weren't there, but spent the next, I was the first few helicopters to cross the berm into Iraq, and I had the last 3 Blackhawks there in December of 2011 when we brought everybody home. And so it went from being a young captain, all my major years spent there. I think I had, between it and Iraq, Afghanistan, 18 deployments back and forth back to that place. Everything from standard raids to landing on rooftops to developing techniques to run cars down in the middle of the desert. And then ended up commanding the company that I was a platoon leader in. Became a battalion commander in the regiment. Spent a ton of time in Afghanistan as a battalion commander. A lot of time in South America. So ultimately, as a task force commander in Iraq, led all of the Special Operations Aviation in Iraq. I was the task force commander when Extortion went down. I was the task force commander when Big Apple went down. So interesting opportunities to be there at times when you're just bad things happen and when a lot of good things happen. I was showing Carrie a picture today of me shaking George Bush's hand right after we killed Zarqawi. 2 2,000-pound bombs on top of him, but that's not what killed him. It was an American soldier's boot in his throat. So it's just interesting times like that. Being in Kuwait, being in those palaces, spending time there when we were looking for Saddam Hussein. I was up there with a whole troop, a Delta troop, and we were chasing him, and I got on a rotator, came home. I was sitting in, I think, the Bahamas with my wife, and I looked up at the news camera, and by God, we had got him. Like 4 days before, I'd been with the package to go do the whole thing. We were chasing him, like relentlessly chasing him. And finally, they found him in a chicken coop, a chicken farm in Kuwait, and not Kuwait, but they're not far from where we were. And so they ended up flying him out of one of my helicopters. So one of my buddies flew in there in a little bird, picked him up, brought him out. So just, getting to experience things like that, I think creates a little bit of a, we'll just figure it out no matter what you throw at us, because they always threw a lot of interesting things at us. So those are probably some more of my more vivid memories. You know, I don't know. I tell people that normal is whatever you get used to. And Carrie could probably tell you what it was like to not always know where we were. I think it was okay because not knowing sometimes was better than knowing. You know, we all had sat phones that all routed through Honolulu, Hawaii. So whenever we called, we were always in Hawaii. I would call my dad from some godforsaken country, and he's like, "What are you doing in Hawaii?" I'm like, "Dad, stop asking me questions. Let's talk about the weather." How's the farm? I think the tougher part wasn't not knowing where you were. It was not knowing when you were leaving or when you were coming home. Because when we would come home, there was no like band or anybody welcoming us home. We just flew in. I would get in my truck and drive home. I'd always call her, tell her, "Hey, I'm coming home." But you'd walk into dinner and they'd be sitting there having dinner, and you would have just left, I don't know, 2 months, deployed somewhere, flying missions every night. And all of a sudden you go from that to 24 hours of transitioning through Germany back to the States, getting off a C-17, and you walk into what is normal life. And you go from, you know, kind of the chaos that is the world you exist in, which is very normal to you, to now you're having dinner with your family and talking about homework. And I think that, to me, was the more challenging part than just the not knowing. Well, I was always very proud of the fact that we did things, but I never felt the need to talk about them. I felt that the anonymity, honestly, was probably the better part of it. The culture of the organization was never to talk about it, which is different than some of the culture of the organizations that we support. To me, that was a bit of the pride of being there. It was the quiet professional. You know, if you look, there's the Night Stalker Creed, and it talks about the only reward is another mission. No one will ever talk about or know about. And so, to me, I thought it was important to live that, because that creates that culture and to maintain that culture. But it was always cool to go home and see the brothers you could talk about it with. That made it special, because it cheapened it when you talked about it with someone that was never there. And so I think, to me, that was part of what made it special. One of the bigger things we were doing a lot of, and there's all the Jessica Lynch's and all that kind of stuff. Quite honestly, they're just, I mean, you know, those have made pretty big news. But you look at things like the Bin Laden raid. That is years and years and years and years and years of planning. I didn't do it, but I spent a bunch of time with guys that did, and we always were perfecting that TTP of how to go do those missions with some very unique capabilities. To figuring out how to run down cars with helicopters. To me, that was one of the most coolest things we ever did. And it wasn't just chasing a car, it was the technology that allowed us to do it. I mean, we built technology and integrated it into our helicopters that allowed us to know exactly where we were, where it was, what my angle was to it, and exactly how far out it was. And I could watch it. I could watch me hit it. You know, so when I think about any one mission, none of one mission was any different than any one other. You know, people will talk about, well, that mission was really unique. It was, but the next night I got back in a cockpit and did another one. I don't know. There was no one to me that was any more special than another. I mean, probably the best one I ever did was the last one I ever did. And the first one. Somewhere in the middle, it's all a blur. It really is. But yeah, those to me were I think, unique things about just being in a place where everybody's a professional. The families are bought in. That's really unique too. You'll find that the wives really hate what it goes on, but they're all kind of bought in. It's a really unique place. So that's something I've done when I retired and got out up here, was I actually created a foundation to go back and support the organization and help raise money to support the families and the kids, because there's a big price to be paid for being a kid in that place. You know, I felt it with my own kids. So yeah, I think, you know, the people who enjoy it being there the most are the ones who kind of sell out to it. They buy into it and believe it. because then it's a special place. Otherwise, it just creates a really cynical person who's pissed off all the time and hates everything. Probably puts on a cut, rides a motorcycle, and does some unruly shit. My middle son, who's the one that's in Hawaii, he's in the artillery. I never thought he'd do anything else except be a soldier. I mean, I've got pictures of him at probably 3 years old with my kid on. And all his life, he wanted to be a soldier. And so he joined the military and, went for something that was a really difficult MOS that had a very, very low pass rate, and ended up, something happened. He made a choice that didn't work out real well for him, and he failed the test, and that was it. Again, binary, black and white. Made it through the dive course twice. I mean, not from start, start to finish twice. And at the end of it, he fails a written test by like one question. Reclass. So you take a young kid who's just super motivated, very driven, very focused, and you throw him into an MOS that he had no desire to do. So what do? You create a very cynical young man who's a phenomenal soldier. He's a great soldier. My youngest, though, I never thought he would join ever. Literally goes to Westville High School, which is they create Ivy League educations out of these kids, right? And April of his senior year, he comes to me. We thought he was going to go to a local school. He didn't do great in school, but he did well enough to really be successful in college. And he comes to me and goes, "Dad, I'm joining the Army." I'm like, "You're doing what?" He goes, "Yeah, I'm joining the Army." I go, "You've lost your mind." He goes, No, I'm joining the Army." I go, "Why?" He goes, "Look, I'm not serious about college anyway. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go drink some beer, smoke some pot, wash out. I'll be in the Army anyway. So why don't I just start there?" I'm like, "Okay, if that's what you're really thinking." I said, "So let's give it a week." He goes, "Nope, I want to go see a recruiter." And this is the same conversation I had with both my sons and their recruiters. And so, okay, mom drives the middle one to the recruiter. And we had some real challenges getting him in because of some things he had done. But we got him in. And mom was a big impetus behind this because she saw what the military could do for a young man. I mean, it really can create a great human being. It can also create some pretty cynical young men too. And I told both of them, your experience may not be what mine was, right? Slightly different worlds. But my youngest one takes his ASVAB and he does exceptionally well. And the recruiter, so he gets on, I'm at the bank. And I go, "I'll talk to your recruiter." I told both of them the exact same thing. And I did the same thing for both of them. "Dad, can you talk to me on the recruiter?" I'm like, "Yep, set up a call." So I get on the speakerphone with me. "Colonel Golden, your son did exceptional on the ASVAB. He's got 20 MOS options. He could be an intel guy. He could be a quartermaster." I'm like, "Stop right there. Tell me what it can be to be cold, wet, and miserable." He goes, "Ha! Infantry and Cav Scout." I go, "Jacob, those are your two choices." He goes, "I want to be a Cav Scout, Dad." I'm like, "Do you need me on the phone any longer?" "No, sir, I got it." I said, "Good." And my thought was, and it always has been this, that if you can create, any young man, the ability to appreciate carpet, a toilet, warm water, well, you could probably create a pretty good human being, because most 18-year-old young men are not very good human beings. And so they both chose combat MOSs. Now, obviously, my youngest son did Syria. Very different experience than mine. Not a good experience whatsoever as a young private in a FOB in Syria, attached to an ODA. Came back with just really struggling with some things. I talked to him a lot. But he's a sergeant now. He's a great leader. So, would I tell my sons to go be soldiers? Yeah, I think I would. Again, I think the challenges in our lives create a better kind of person than the successes anyway. It's taught both of them to definitely be humble and to understand that life is a struggle. But very different to be a dad of a soldier than to be the leader of soldiers. I never understood that. And I've gone back and spoken to a couple of colleges, and one of them I spoke about, the 3 reasons you should be an exceptional leader. And I talked about it from the perspective of being the parents of soldiers. And as a battalion commander, I can remember examples of times when I made decisions that maybe had I thought about it as the father of a soldier, I would have made a slightly different decision. But very proud of our sons who are soldiers. I don't think they'll both do careers. One's been in for 6 years and the other one's been in for about 3. And my youngest one, the 3, just took 4 years, but he's changing his MOS to an Intel MOS. But very different as the father of soldiers. I had to stop from myself from wanting to get involved. And learn to listen and just appreciate the fact that they were just venting. They didn't really want me to do anything, but it really bothers me, especially when leaders suck. But what I realized was that, man, these are young sergeants. These aren't experienced leaders. I'm used to dealing with my first level leader would be an E6 who'd probably been in for 6, 8, 10 years, much more experience. And so I would explain to them, I'm like, well, the fact that you recognize that as something you shouldn't do means you're a good leader. So yeah, it's been a very different experience.